On today's episode of Exploring Politics, we bring you a very interesting and important panel discussing the current conflict in Iran. Please stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Exploring Politics. I'm your host Peter Rapp, and today I am joined by Nick Przoshin and two wonderful Salle professors to understand what is currently going on in Iran. Would you two like to introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'm Miguel Glatzer. I teach in the political science department.
There, I'm Lyman Stebbins. Thanks for having me. I teach in the history department and the honors program.
Thank you much for being here today. We have a lot of questions for you about what is going on in Iran at the moment. So I guess to begin, Iranian history is very long and full of a lot of conflict. So we'll start with the 50s with the overthrow of Mossadegh. He was their elected prime minister or president, and he was overthrown. Could you give us a story as to why that is?
Sure. Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in August of 1953 in a coup d'etat in which the CIA, British intelligence, and the Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, cooperated together to overthrow him. I do think, though, when we're thinking about 20th century Iranian history, a very good way to think, Mossadegh is in 53, but they're sort of bookended by two events that I'll just mention briefly. One is the constitutional revolution of 1905, 1911, and then the second is the 78, 79 that you'll get to. But I think there's three themes that you might want to keep an eye on. One is foreign intervention, which we just mentioned. Two is democracy. You mentioned that he was democratically elected. And three is the state's need to develop power in the institutions of a modern state. So I think Mossadegh sits in an intersection of some of those forces.
And the proximate cause for his throw by the British and the Americans with the Shah's cooperation was his decision to nationalize Iranian oil, particularly with respect to a British oil company. He had wanted to audit the books to make sure that Iran was receiving enough royalties from that exploitation of the natural resource, and the British company refused to do so. Right. So he then decided to nationalize, and the British and the Americans weren't happy with that.
And the Americans were trying to navigate the oil nationalization issue for some time. One thing that tipped the Americans into becoming involved was also the Cold War, was critical. The rise of the Iranian left and the Tudeh party, and fears that Mossadegh would cooperate with them. And so, the Mossadegh moment has oil resources, geopolitics, as well as the internal dimension. So it's a very important moment in modern Iranian history, and one that did solidify a negative interpretation impression amongst many Iranians of the United States.
Right. After the Shah was, achieved power in the coup d'etat, what was life like under the Shah in the 60s and 70s?
The 50s, 60s, and 70s were a period of enormous change in Iran. Social change, the population doubles, Tehran's grows leaps and bounds in terms of population. The economy shifts from more agriculture to oil, of course. So it's a period of tremendous change, but it's also a period of tremendous tensions, and perhaps you'd like to speak to some of those tensions, Miguel.
Sure.
So the Shah in many ways was a westernizer, right? And he promoted women's rights. He promoted education, including for women, Western dress. But at the same time, he used Savak, the secret police, in ways that really were brutal and repressed dissent, right? And so a combination of this westernization, the economic development that you spoke about, led to a flourishing of a wide array of opposition to the Shah, right? From leftist groups to more conservative groups to religious groups. So it was a failed attempt at westernization. In some ways, it parallels Ataturk and Turkish modernization and westernization, right? But the repression was really, really awful.
Yeah, so now that we've discussed a little bit about the modern history, what exactly led to like the Islamic Revolution part of Iranian history?
Well, it wasn't clear that it would be an Islamic revolution. Khomeini, who becomes the first Ayatollah of the Islamic Republic, he was in exile in Paris, and he gave many, many interviews to the Western press. And in those interviews, he presented himself as a moderate. He presented himself as a transitional figure, as a unifying figure that would allow pluralism in Iran. And so he became, because he was critical of the Shah, he became a sort of rallying figure for the vast array of opposition groups. And you had many women supporting the Ayatollah, right? Believing that he was a moderate figure, right? And then it was a bait and switch, right? When he arrives in Tehran, he consolidates power, right? He arrives after the Shah leaves Iran, ostensibly for medical attention, and he very ruthlessly ends up decimating the opposition. Right?
And at the same time, he had articulated his political vision while in exile. And it is the vision which informs the constitution of the Islamic Republic today. And it was a radical position. And the argument he made was that legitimacy ought to be defined by religious knowledge. In other words, that if God's law is to be implemented on earth, then the person who rules should be the expert at God's law, at Sharia. And in making that claim, while some panelists would say that's a sort of medieval notion or sort of a traditional notion, Islamic notion, a theocratic notion, it's actually quite radical and quite modern. Many of his colleagues in the high ranks of the Shia clergy and the Ayatollahs did not endorse that position. And so he was a person who had a vision for a new kind of Islamic government in Iran in which he would rule by virtue of his religious credentials. And the office of the supreme leader, recently, up until a few days ago, held by his successor, Ali Khamenei, also took that position with regard to rule. So he is a revolutionary, even in Islamic terms. And yes, he certainly then purged all of his rivals, both the left, the moderates, and also within the Shia spectrum of opposition. There are a variety of viewpoints that he also made sure would only focus on his own.
Right. Now, moving on to the modern Iranian state that Khomeini and Khamenei built together, how exactly is that state structured in terms of the different branches of government, executive, legal?
So it's complicated, right? There are lots of peak institutions, but the Ayatollah sits at the top, and he's considered the supreme leader. Very importantly, there's the Guardian Council, which plays a really important role in barring candidates who want to run for office, right? So Iran does hold elections. There are legislative elections, but a lot of people aren't allowed to run, right? And so it's a very much restricted ballot, right, that is allowed, right? And then you have a president who's under the tutelage of the Ayatollah. And then you have a judiciary that's not independent, and you have many, many state security bodies, right?
Yeah, the government combines democratic and theocratic elements. And as Professor Glatzer mentioned, the electorate votes for the president, the parliament, and the assembly of experts, which then vets the future supreme leaders. But I was in Iran many years ago, and I sort of would ask people, so how does this system hold on if there is opposition? And as Professor Glatzer was suggesting, the supreme leader has under his portfolio control of the armed forces, the press, and the courts, and those are the mechanisms of power. Of course, more recently, the Revolutionary Guard Corps has really become the major prop of the regime. It has a number of financial and other interests, but we saw in the recent crackdowns, ultimately this government is willing to use violence to maintain power, as was demonstrated in January, not for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
So, follow-up question. Can we talk more about what is the guidance patrol within Iran?
Sure, yeah. The guidance patrol is sometimes referred to as the religious or moral police. And they're most famous for policing dress, particularly women's dress, right? And whether the head covering meets the specifications necessary to pass muster. They famously kidnapped a young woman who was not wearing the precise specifications, and she dies in their custody. It's quite clear that it was a violent death, and that led to an eruption of many people protesting, right? Similar to what you were mentioning, right? The recent protests over inflation and food prices, lack of electricity. Iran has seen these periodic eruptions of mass mobilization, mass protests, right? And the second most recent one was due precisely to the actions of the religious police.
And the enforcement of religious dress standards was part of the Revolutionary Project. It was instituted almost immediately. When I was in Iran, it was very much enforced. I've been amazed to see on videos of Iran over the last couple of years, just sort of men on the street videos, sort of walking down the streets, how many young women are not wearing head coverings, particularly in various parts of the city. So I think that these protests from a few years back certainly had an impact. And I think this underscores back to that sort of democracy rights channel in Iranian history. The role of women in challenging this regime has been consistent, and they've been arrested, and it's been one of the weak points of the regime, its anxieties and the way in which popular pressure from half the population, and not all women, of course, support revisions to the dress requirements, but it's a key point in where opposition and state meet.
Right, and going off of where opposition and state meet, when the state is met with protests against its policies or the standard of living in the country at the moment, like we've recently seen, how does the government respond, or especially with the last protest, how does the government respond?
It responds with a tremendous amount of violence, right? So with the most recent protests, the minimum number of people shot and killed is 6,500, but credible estimates estimate that 20,000 to even 30,000 people died in a very short period of time, right? In just a number of days. There's torture routinely used in prisons, abuse. Iran uses the death penalty with great frequency. In some cases, the death penalty has been carried out publicly, public hangings. So it's a very, very brutal regime, right?
Yes, that's the case. I think what's also interesting is this long tradition of nonviolent protest in Iran, going back to some of those events that I have mentioned. I think it's very interesting that the Islamic Republic itself was founded in some sense on nonviolent protest in the streets. And then just last month, not for the first time, it uses violence in the streets to keep power. So yeah, it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult. And my heart goes out to all those people in Iran who have been affected by this violence and the violence going on during the war as well.
Yeah, I suppose it's time to move on to the elephant in the room in the war. And I guess we could start with a segue into it would be what does this war mean for those protesters that want democracy, that want increased civil rights. Does this war help them? I'm personally, I don't believe it does, but what is your view of the situation?
I think it's very difficult to protest during a war. There is an aerial bombardment occurring. The Iranian government has long used, again, that's the foreign intervention threat, has long condemned its enemies as being agents of a foreign power. And so particularly in a security crisis where the government is being attacked by Israel and the United States, who have a, shall we say, controversial reputation in Iran, the government will use war to actually, I believe, continue to repress and to do so even harder. I personally would find it difficult to imagine people taking the streets today. I think I just would find that difficult. Unless, are the Americans going to do close air support to unarmed protesters? It just strikes me as a situation I can't quite imagine.
At the same time, that's absolutely true, and the protesters are in a very vulnerable position, right? But it's also true that the regime has quite low levels of support. And that's in part due to the escalating economic crisis that the country faces. It's facing a massive drought, so water is often not available. Electricity is also often not available. So the degree of support, economic take-home pay, right? The standard of living has declined a lot. There's inflation. So the percentage of the people who support the regime is really quite low, right? Some of the estimates from a Dutch organization that tries to measure public opinion in Iran says only 12% of the population supports the regime currently. That might be too low, but it's indicative of low support, right? So but I would not, protesting right now would be extremely dangerous.
Perhaps if the state is destroyed, protesters will have, seems to be the logic, such as there is, advanced by the United States with regard to outcomes, but there seems to be a lot of pieces that would have to fall to make it just so. And with regard to support for the government, I do think it is a minority for sure, but there is support, and that support could be ideological. It could also, and it's probably more often the case, constituents who have a vested interest, particularly financially in the regime, whether that be a job, whether that be a pension for someone who was killed in the Iran-Iraq War, any number of ways that bind a group of support to the government. I think everyone is watching to see whether the Iranian state can sustain itself during this aerial bombardment.
Okay. So what do we think this justification is for the war itself and just the parts of Israel and the U.S., this war or conflict?
Well, Israel has a very clear stake, right? Because Iran has been a major funder of insurgencies and terrorist networks that have destabilized the Middle East and that have been hostile to Israel, right? So they've funded Hamas, they've funded the Houthis in Yemen, they've funded Hezbollah, Iraqi insurgents, they supported the Assad regime in Syria, and they've shown a willingness to use ballistic missiles against Israel and to supply missiles and arms to these various proxy groups, right? So from an Israeli perspective, trying to destroy the government and destroy its capacity to hit Israel is really important, right? Israel sees Iran as its undeniably major threat, right? And especially the attempts to build nuclear weapons, right? The U.S. has offered a whole range of different reasons, some helping the Iranian people, some dealing with also the ballistic missiles, some saying the nuclear threat. The imminence of these threats to the United States is relatively low, leading to a lot of legal questions about the justification for this war.
Yes, I concur. I would add perhaps that since in the last several years, Israel has been able to defeat essentially many of Iran's local allies, be they Hezbollah, et cetera. And then the Syrian regime collapsed. And so I think the Israelis see a unique opportunity to now attack Iran. So I think you can sort of see Iran's axis of resistance, as they term it, has been rolled back right to the gates of Tehran, perhaps, if you from the aerial. With your American case, it is the shifting justification. There is also, I would add to your list, and it is a sort of a list, it depends, it's sort of a grab bag, a historical memory of wrongs done by Iranians to Americans, be it in bombings or in was it Beirut, right? Or the IEDs in Iraq. But I do think that the American presentation is scattered, and I think it's an issue here at home. Clearly, a party political issue and an issue very much connected to the presidency of Donald Trump in terms of his politics and what he thinks to be his legacy. So I'm not entirely clear what we're doing, and I have concerns that lack of clarity will produce outcomes which are unknown or harmful to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest effects of the war so far is the supreme leader, the Ayatollah of Iran, Khamenei, was killed in a missile strike over the weekend. What does his death mean for Iran, the Iranian state, the future of Iran?
Well, there was already constitutional provision for the replacement of his office through the Assembly of Experts. Recent reporting suggesting he had a succession plan in place anyway. So it's unclear. The state has survived this week. It has, and I think it could have not survived. Who knows? We do not yet have another supreme leader, but the Iranian government, as I said, if state building is one of those themes, it's had 47 years to build the institutions of the Republic, the Islamic Republic. So. And they seem to be pretty committed to maintaining them. So I'm not suggesting they can't be broken, but we are unclear as to what his death means. His death was one of the first agenda items of the war. It was conceived of as an element of regime change, and we are still waiting to see what its meaning is.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting. He chose not to enter a bunker. When he died, state media didn't say that he was killed. They said that he had the opportunity to become a martyr. And I think for the Shia faith, that's a big thing. I think Iran, they knew he was going to die. He was 80 years old, and they obviously did have a succession plan in place. And the U.S. wants to use this opportunity or Israel also wants to use this as an opportunity to maybe put in Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah of Iran, who was deposed in the original revolution. Who is Reza Pahlavi?
He's, excuse me. He is not particularly well liked in Europe and in Washington and in the Gulf states. He is seen sometimes as a little bit of a gadfly, unreliable, someone who asks for a lot of money, but it's not clear what he's planning on doing with it. There are some reports that he has some degree of support amongst young Iranians, but there isn't really a movement around him, right? At least yet. He says different things to different people. The U.S. sees him as unreliable, right? He's saying some of the right things, right? But then he has a lot of different groups that he has to sort of make side deals with, right? If he could become a transitional figure and allow democratic elections, that would be a very positive. That would be a very positive scenario. But it's unclear that he would be able to even get that role.
Yeah, I mean, his politics is symbolic. It's a nostalgia for a period of time 50 years ago. I imagine he seems to get a lot of support outside of the country. He is a member of the diaspora, the Iranian exile community, which is, after 47 years, millions of people around the world. I'm not saying they all support him, but I'm saying there's this other phenomenon of the exile community all over the world, and he's a prominent figure in that community. He has, as far as I know, no administrative experience. He hasn't been in Iran in 50 years. If his symbolic value could bring people together, fantastic. But he would not be at the top of my deck of likely outcomes in terms of becoming a transitional figure. I would not imagine that. But historians, we cannot predict the future, despite what people might think we can do.
Of course, that is true. But it is time to move to our final thoughts. So, what would be your prediction or takeaway from what has unfolded over the past couple days? You have about a minute. Whoever would like to go first.
I think we're at a very perilous moment. There's a real risk of chaos and disorder emerging in Iran. Iran has a very diverse population. There are important religious and ethnic minorities. There are well over 1 million people with guns who are part of this sort of informal militia, plainclothes militia. The protesters do not have guns. So the peril, right, the risk is that Iran could fall into mayhem, right? The positive scenario is that the government would be weakened enough. Police stations are being targeted now. The optimistic scenario is the protesters could rally enough people to produce a government that delivers for the Iranian people. But I see this as a very perilous moment.
And Dr. Simmons?
I would have to agree. I mean, I think if the state is destroyed, then you will have bad outcomes. The hope is that enough of the state will essentially turn towards a new future, and that's a very difficult eye of a needle. The other outcome, of course, is that the state remains in power. And this gets back to the American-Israeli action. Ground invasion is not probably going to happen. Can that diplomatic and political needle be threaded through aerial bombardment? TBD. And there are limits on American power, and there are limits on Israeli power. There's limits on munitions. There's limits of time on station. There are limits on presidential attention. Whether a month from now he will be focused on this. So I think there's many unknowns, and it does underscore the fact that with war we have many unknowns.
Of course, that's you can never predict the future, but we can always learn from the past. So thank you all for coming on today. Of course, it's been great having you all watching today. Please be sure to go follow our Instagram at Exploring Politics LTV, and tune in next time. Have a good one.